Back in the summer of 2014, I was living in Oregon. Nina, my wife's friend, and her husband Joe owned a nice-sized boat that he had docked in one of the coastal towns. Having lived there a couple of years while only going to the coast twice the entire time, when we were offered a ride on it one summer day, we agreed. I'd never really been on a boat, and I've always wanted to see what it was like to sail on the sea. I used to live in the deserts of Arizona, so living close to the sea was a real treat for me. Add to that the lush green of the state and the many forests it has, and I was awestruck. I never used to see much green in Arizona. Granted, it rained all the damn time, and it did get pretty cold. After all, where I lived, I was only a few miles from the halfway point between the Arctic and the equator, but it was a small price to me to live in such beauty. Plus, the no sales tax the state had didn't hurt its case either. So on the day of the trip, I was excited. We lived maybe 3 hours from where they lived, so we headed out early. It was 10 in the morning when we arrived. The summer air was in full swing and the ocean was breathing salty. It wasn't as hot as one might expect in the summer, but it was still pretty warm. We went over to their oceanside property and spent the rest of the morning and part of the afternoon hitting the shops and eating at one of the seafood restaurants. We then went back to their place to chill out for a bit before we headed out to the dock. By then it was almost 5 in the afternoon and the dock was part empty, probably because a lot of people had the same idea we had. When I first laid eyes on the SS Seafarer, I was stunned. Now to me, this was a majestic beast. To Joe, it was like part of his way of life. He'd had it for a year and loved its roomy deck and single-engine prowess. I was in awe, though. I was excited to get out on it. He gave me a tour of the boat before we set sail out onto the Pacific. We sailed out far enough that we lost sight of land. He knew the sea well and knew where the international waters were. After a bit of sailing, part of the time of which he let me take the helm, we stopped and looked out into the empty vastness of the Pacific Ocean. Joe whipped out a cooler with drinks and we sat on the deck and talked for hours. The change in temperature was noticeable when the sun set just after 9 p.m. We'd brought coats and sweaters as we knew it would get a bit chilly. The moon was out, but not very bright. We stayed another hour talking and not thinking about the problems in the world or in our lives for the moment. I was the one who first heard the sound emanating from the water. It was like a soft howl, but low enough that the others didn't seem to notice it. I heard it though, and began wondering what it could be. I was excited at the thought that it could be a whale. After a while it did it again, only slightly louder. This time the others heard it as well. My wife looked around and asked what that was. Nina said that she didn't know, and Joe began to actively listen as I was. After a few minutes, the sound was heard again. This time, instead of a howl, it was more like a growl. I started to suspect that it wasn't a whale and asked Joe if he'd heard anything like that before. He said no. Anyway, it got quiet again for a few minutes. My wife and Nina started to talk again when we heard a large splash which sounded way off but was loud enough for us to hear it. Joe said that if it was a whale, it was the biggest one he'd ever heard, and even at a distance it still wouldn't have been that loud. Then, the air suddenly turned foul and rancid. It was a horrible putrid smell like rotting fish and shit mixed in with salty air. My wife started to throw up while I held myself down the best I could. Then we heard the loudest growl I've ever heard. This was loud and it echoed through the air. Then we heard another loud splash. That's when Joe decided it was high time to get the hell out of there. As he raced to the helm to start the boat up, we heard the growl again, only this time it echoed from under the water. As he started the engine, the boat rocked suddenly back and forth as if a sudden wave had hit us. Once the engine started, he tried to pull forward. We moved, then suddenly stopped. Joe pulled forward again and then suddenly stopped. We weren't moving. He pulled forward again, this time increasing speed. We didn't move a fucking inch. I think it dawned on Joe and I at the same time that something was holding the boat. Joe let off the gas and stopped it altogether. We all realized in horror at the same time that the boat was starting to move on its own further out to sea. Joe immediately started moving forward again. He then reversed it and then pulled forward again. This time we felt a jerk. Something was indeed holding onto the boat. He reversed again and then pulled forward. This time it jerked, followed by what sounded like a screech coming from under the water. Joe did this again and again. The final time he broke free. As he sped off, we heard a splash, followed by the loudest screeching roar I've ever heard. This too echoed through the air. Well, we made it back to the dock, tired and exhausted, but most of all relieved to be on land. We drove back to their place where we stayed that night in the guest room. Next morning, we discussed what happened over breakfast. Joe and I agreed that it was some kind of sea monster. The girls weren't sure what it was, but didn't want to say it was a sea monster. Joe and I decided to head back to the dock that day. He wanted to inspect his boat. After noticing nothing around the boat, he decided to check under it. He put on a swimsuit and a breathing tank and jumped in. Now he was under there for a few minutes before he surfaced. As I helped him up, I noticed the look on his face. He was shaken. No, he was scared shitless. When I asked him what was wrong, he looked at me with frightened eyes. He said that whatever it was out there must have been big. When he checked the bottom, he noticed indentations on it, as if something had grabbed onto it hard, and it was on both sides of the boat and ran the length of it. Then he added that the propeller blade had what looked like bits of flesh around it, which meant that when we broke free, we must have cut the thing in the process. Somewhere out there in the dark depths of the ocean, there's a monster that's injured and angry. God help whoever encounters it next.